Okay. Whoop. Looks like everyone's now signed on. So at this point, I'll hand it to Dr. Charles Escher Small.
Okay, so welcome everybody. This is our fellowship seminar series that we have on Tuesdays. So everybody welcome, and I think people are still logging in. So I'll give it about 30 more seconds before we start. So just bear with me for a moment. I'll just give it a little more time for people to settle in, and then we'll start in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to start. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce to you today Chloe Pinto. Chloe is actually a research fellow at ISGAP and is a member of our academic steering committee and the fellowship steering committee. So it's been an amazing pleasure to work with Chloe. Chloe is a PhD candidate in the English faculty at the University of Cambridge in the UK. She completed a master's in literature at the University of Oxford, and her current research focuses on the relationship between artwork and anti-Semitism in Ezra Pound's work and thought, and lies at the intersection between the politics of exclusion and the interaction between text, ideology, and image. Chloe's overall critical focus is on the interplay between visual culture and violence, and she has written on Ezra Pound's late Canton's 1990s American prisoner literature and the trickiness of archives. She is currently a co-convener of the Cambridge Theory, Criticism, and Cultural Seminar Series and supervises undergraduates and postgraduates on the subject matter of poetry, film, and literary criticism. So today we're going to look, Chloe's going to speak on issues of anti-Semitism and COVID, and Chloe, welcome, and it's nice to see you again, and the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, ISGAP, for hosting me. And hi, everyone. So great to see you all today. It's wonderful to see so many people tuning in from all over the world. It's really amazing. While I share my screen, please allow me to take a second to note that this talk will contain discussions of violence and racist and anti-Semitic language. So on that note, I shall begin. It was a bright and sunny day like any other, until it wasn't. In Los Angeles, on the 22nd of August, 2020, without any prior warning, a 6-foot banner was unfurled over the Florence Avenue exit in Inglewood, the busiest point on the 405 freeway across the state. It contained a message. The Jews want a race war. It remained there for hours. Later in the day, 2 accompanying messages appeared. The Jews want a race war. Honk if you know. GoyimTV.com. According to passers-by, the number of cars honking were too many to count. This is where the link takes us. This is the homepage for GoyimTV.com. Goyim is Yiddish for not Jewish. Notice how it's knowable to us, how closely it resembles familiar sites such as YouTube, how easy it is to access and navigate content. Suggested search topics include cultural Marxism, hoaxes, words, and false flags, hollow hoax of World War I and World War II, Jewish genocides, paedophilia or paed-Jewphilia, as it is referred to here, and pharmaceuticals and the coronavirus. This is an organized, archived, and digitized vortex of classical anti-Semitic tropes. The sign leading us here appeared unannounced and unceremoniously in broad daylight. It seemed to come out of the blue. How did we get from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, sitting bored in traffic, to arrive here in the underbelly of the internet? Or to reframe the question, what were the signs that we didn't see before? Today, I will focus on this final suggested search term, coronavirus conspiracy theories concerning Jews and illness. I will be using memes from online fringe far-right forums and particular spaces on the internet. My talk will be in 3 parts: definitions, disease, and data. Let's start with some definitions. What exactly is anti-Semitism? How is it related to Judaism, or the Jewish people, or the Jew? And are these the same thing? The history of the term anti-Semitism illuminates how and why such a slippery word refers to such a stable and enduring hatred across history. The term anti-Semitism was first coined by Wilhelm Marr, a German journalist and cultural historian from the late 19th century, in his 1879 pamphlet, The Victory of Judaism over Germanism. Marr argued that the difference between the German and Jew distilled down to racial differences. Total assimilation and even forced conversion could not stop the threat of this alien other, and he started the League of Anti-Semites, an organization committed to forcibly removing Jews from Germany. Marr's choice of the term anti-Semitism was a powerful and calculated decision. By introducing pseudo-scientific racial terminology into the field, the term anti-Semite refers hazily on the surface to being anti-Semite, the Semitic tribes descended from Shem in the Bible, yet it ultimately points back to hating the Jew. Indeed, Marr expressed the explicit desire to avoid describing his Jew hatred in such graphic terms. He needed to convert people with something believable yet ambiguous. He needed something more poetic. The term anti-Semitism is a code word, part of a labyrinth of coded language connected to anti-Jewish hatred. Indeed, the birth of the word anti-Semitism was itself an act of anti-Semitism. So I will be using the term anti-Semitism interchangeably for anti-Jewish hatred. We can identify 3 distinct strands of this prejudice across history, and this hinges on how the anti-Semite defines the Jew. These are not the only forms of anti-Semitism, but they are particularly relevant for my talk today. The first targets Judaism as an ethno-religion with a set of rituals, practices, laws, sacred texts, and a specific history of peoplehood. European Christianity's anti-Semitism derives from this. The early Christians found proof of the inferiority of the Jews in their refusal to accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah and to convert to Christianity. This blindness marked the Jew as different, yet they were potentially redeemable through conversion. The second is racial anti-Semitism, which is the belief that Jews constitute a distinct ethnic racial group which is in some way abhorrent or inferior. A combination of growing nationalism, the rise in eugenics, resentment over the socio-economic success of the influx of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern to Central Europe led to this virulent strain of anti-Semitism, which became law in Nazi Germany's Nuremberg race laws of 1935. It was believed that this formed a radical break with the more medieval traditions of Jew hating, but this is not true. In fact, this is the extension and secularization of tropes originating in religious anti-Semitism. Particularly relevant for our conversations today is the tripartite distinction made by these eugenicists of the Aryan, Semitic, Hamitic races, with Hamitic referring to people of African origin and Semitic standing in for Jewish. We must note that a strand of racial anti-Semitism existed much earlier. For example, in concerns over the forced conversion of Spanish Jews to Catholicism, the Conversos, following the Spanish expulsion of 1492, which resulted in the ideology of the cleanliness of blood, codified in Toledo in 1449. The Jewish body is always a source of anxiety for anti-Semites. The third form of anti-Jewish hatred that we'll be focusing on is the figural Jew. Here, the figure of the Jew functions as a trope. It is otherness, fulfilling the apophatic function of defining negativity. Negative features, in turn, are understood to be characteristically Jewish. This is not a personal or a religious identity or an experience of bodily materiality in a lived world, but a bloodless abstraction. It is a false projection. The Jew has existed in the history of thought as a figure for deracination, uprootedness, a disruption to the structure of belonging, an unstable sign of confusion or indeterminacy that is locally defined. This explains how traditional Jewish stereotypes can be so deeply contradictory at the same time. The Jew is all-powerful, and yet also the weakest, most pathetic parasite in history. This explains how anti-Semitism is a form of both punching up and punching down. Or, for another example, how the Jew can represent both capitalism and communism at the same time in different places. Jacques Derrida's concept of the pharmacon from his 1981 essay Plato's Pharmacy is helpful for us here. The pharmacon is a figure which functions as poison, remedy, and scapegoat simultaneously, and it is necessary for projects of nation building. Indeed, as Jean-Paul Sartre observes in Anti-Semite and Jew from 1946, the anti-Semite is in the unhappy position of having a vital need for the very enemy he wishes to destroy. So, if this is how the anti-Semite defines the Jew, how do Jewish people define anti-Semitism? The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism is as follows. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. We can infer from this that anti-Semitism is a combination of attitude and action. Intention matters, and ignorance is not an excuse. The IHRA working definition contains 11 clauses as examples of clarification, and I've included them on the slide. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and on Monday, the 9th of November 2020, the University of Cambridge adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, a move welcomed by Jewish students, administrative staff, members of the academic faculty, and PhD candidates alike, for actively providing a safe environment for all members of the community. This coincided with the anniversary of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, a crucial event in the Nazis' brutal regime against Jews, Romani, people of color, LGBTQIA+, neurodivergent, physically disabled people, and more. On that night in 1938, 30,000 German Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. The diseased Jewish body is one of the most enduring anti-Semitic tropes of all. It is a point of collision between religious anti-Semitism, the corporeality of racial anti-Semitism, and the Jew as a figure or trope. Building from the very vital work done by the Community Service Trust, we can identify a typology of anti-Semitic coronavirus conspiracy theories, each a manifestation of classical tropes updated for the digital age. Number 1, there is no virus. It's a Jewish conspiracy. Myths regarding a Jewish conspiracy have existed for centuries, but they were made textual in 1903 by one particular work, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It supposedly contained the transcription of secret meetings of Jewish leaders as these elders plotted to take over the world. It is completely false, a work of fiction, a classic in the literature of propaganda and prejudice that was taken as fact. In 24 sections, intricate plans to turn non-Jews into slaves and infiltrate every single institution in the world are described at length. Protocol 12 describes how literature and journalism are two of the most important educative forces, and therefore our government will become proprietor of the majority of journals. It will put us in possession of a tremendous influence upon the public mind. Here, we see the pervasive idea that Jews control the media, and in doing so, control minds. Protocol 21 describes how we shall replace the money markets by grandiose government credit institutions, the object of which will be to fix the price of industrial values in accordance with government views. Jews allegedly controlling the economy for their own gain, specifically by working in collusion with a duped government. The Jews are the puppet masters. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written by Pierre Ivanovich Rachkovsky in Russia as an attempt to provide a scapegoat to shift public unrest from the Bolshevik-led movement of the 1890s. It proved an unprecedented popular success. It exerted an enormous influence over Nazi propaganda. And in the US, the hoax was widely distributed by Henry Ford, who Americanized the forged document in 1920 as the International Jew, the world's foremost problem. It ran as excerpts in the newspaper The Dearborn Independent for 91 weeks straight and was translated into 16 languages. It became mainstream. The Macpherson Report of 1999 proposed that a racist incident is any incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. Here, the authority of the victim is granted credibility for ensuring that allegations of racist behavior are investigated. Regarding anti-Semitism, the trope of the Jewish conspiracy theory has proven so powerful that it has, in some cases, emptied the allegation of anti-Semitism of meaning. How can the Jews be victims of anti-Semitism? How can the Jews be victims of anything? Whenever claims are made of the false exaggeration, politicized smear, or weaponization of anti-Semitism by a small group for a specific purpose, we can hear an echo of this text. The idea of the Jewish conspiracy is, ironically, the most powerful conspiracy of all. So, there is a virus, but that's the Jewish conspiracy. This is the idea that the coronavirus was manufactured in Israeli labs and is being used as a biological weapon, specifically by the Israeli government to poison Palestinians. It's the Jew flu, and the pharmaceuticals will make a profit off the plague as a form of poisoning. In the mid-14th century, as an explanation for the destruction of the Black Death, Jews were said to be poisoners of wells, the mass murderers of Christians. As Walter Laqueur in The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism describes, this accusation became part and parcel of anti-Semitic dogma and language, resurfacing again in 1953 as the doctor's plot during Stalin's final days, where hundreds of Jewish physicians in the Soviet Union were arrested and killed on the charge of having poisoned prominent communist leaders. Similar charges were made in the 1980s and 1990s in radical Arab nationalist and Muslim nationalist propaganda that accused Jews of spreading infectious diseases through acts of poisoning, including AIDS. In 2016, Palestinian Authority President and PLO Chairman Mahmoud Abbas similarly accused rabbis of poisoning Palestinian wells. Number 3, the Jew spreads the virus because the Jew is the virus. Sander L. Gilman has argued that the unchanging relationship of the Jew as a figure to the world of disease, pathology, and death is part of the history of culture. Across his work, but particularly in The Jew's Body from 1991, he has examined every single part of the imagined Jewish body in relation to anti-Semitism, beginning with the top of the head, bulbous, protruding under the kippah or Jewish skull cap, down to the foot, deformed, contorted, limping. A historical hangover from the medieval Christianity plays where the Jew became interchangeable with the limping devil, physically and spiritually turning on his heel away from Christ and into hell. The limping Jew was also seen as a mark of the stereotypical wandering Jew, rootless and stateless, destined to limp to the ends of the earth. Coronavirus has consolidated national borders. States are closed. The spread of an infectious disease means that the borders between the body and its outside environment dissolve. Parts and particles of the Jew can circulate and wander freely once more. Sander L. Gilman provides a succinct account of the representation of the diseased Jewish body. Among several hundred of their kind, he had not encountered a single person without a blemish or other repulsive feature, for they are either pale and yellow or swarthy. They have in general big heads, big mouths, inverted lips, protruding eyes, and bristle-like eyelashes, large ears, crooked feet, hands that hang below their knees, and big, shapeless warts, or are otherwise asymmetrical and malproportioned in their limbs. Gilman has noted how the yellow skin of the diseased Jew led to the false diagnosis of Judenkranz, a fabled skin and hair disease which caused the infected individual to turn black. These ideas were then transported across time and space and translated into eugenicist racial ideas of the Semitic race infecting the Hamitic, or people of African origin, as opposed to the healing presence of the Aryan German. We remember the sign, "The Jews want a race war." In Hitler's Mein Kampf, the chapters Causes of the Collapse and Nation and Race yield the densest accumulation of metaphors and analogies between Jews and plague. The Jews are described as a typical parasite, and the body is the battleground for the Jewish conspiracy. Let's turn to Shylock's famous speech. "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that." The Jewish body is amputated, split and stitched back together, a patchwork of excess parts and material drives. Notice how Shylock claims, "If we are like you in the rest." If we are like you. Not if we are you, for we only resemble you. We may come close, but the Jewish body, no matter how it cracks and cleaves, is always something else inside. Shylock desires his pound of flesh, a fusion of two anti-Semitic motifs, the blood libel, or the medieval conceit that Jews kill Christian children to drain their blood, and circumcision as a form of castration, or, given the history of psychoanalysis beginning with Freud, a form of Jewish mind control connected to genitalia. In fact, Jews were believed to be super spreaders of sexually transmitted diseases for this reason, and the limping gait of the Jew was also seen as a syphilitic symptom. Of all the icons of Jewish physical identity, none is as powerful as the meaning ascribed to the Jewish nose. Appearing in the early modern period as a visible marker of difference, the legitimacy of the Jewish nose stereotype owes much to the racial taxonomies of the late 19th and earliest 20th century anthropologists, and by the 1930s, the Nazis had developed their own version of the stereotype. As a protruding facial feature, it lends itself to a host of metonymic images. The Jewish nose for news and tendency to look down their noses from their perch for global domination. The conceit of the Jewish nose was also connected to the Futur Judaicus, or Jewish stench, the perceived myth of the Jewish smell rooted in medieval comparisons between Christ's perfumed corpse and Judas's stinking, rotten body. In the time of coronavirus and face masks, cutting the Jewish nose off to spite the face isn't an option online. Now, I've spoken about the figural Jew, but who is this particular figure? We've seen him appearing again and again in different contexts, different outfits, and even different colors. This is the Happy Merchant meme, who first appeared online in 2015, complete with the same anti-Semitic traits that Gilman listed in the account from 1643. A 2018 study on 4 web communities, Twitter, Reddit, Gab, and 4chan's forum Politically Incorrect, confirmed that the Happy Merchant meme was the most popular image being circulated. We should note that this image has become so influential, particularly in far-right and white supremacist circles online, that even the sketch of his hands and beard are immediately recognizable. the Jewish body is split apart once more. So, if coronavirus is a biological weapon that can be used by the Jews, does that mean it can be used against the Jews? Here we reach our fourth variation of anti-Semitic coronavirus conspiracy theories. Not the Holocaust, but the Holocaust. This is the direct invitation to act on genocidal impulse by deliberately infecting and killing as many Jewish people as possible, and the disproportionately high death rates of members of the Jewish community at the beginning of the global pandemic were celebrated online in certain spaces. There's even merchandise being sold for it. Another iteration of the idea of the Holocaust comes in the form of trauma porn, which was a trend on social media site TikTok. Content creators would dress up as deceased Jewish victims of the Holocaust, often wearing makeup to suggest bruises and burns, posting from heaven to describe their deaths in the concentration camps in excruciating detail. This is the fetishization of trauma as a talking point. We should note that the date of this post was one day after the sign "The Jews Want a Race War" appeared in Los Angeles. This brings us to the final part of my talk today, a consideration of the relationship between data and discourse, or how do we find the terminology to express the particular nature of anti-Semitic language online, and how to map how it spreads, and what does this reveal about the complexities of contemporary anti-Jewish hatred? I'd like to shine a light on some very important work conducted by my colleague at ISGAP, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, and his colleagues at the Network Contagion Research Institute into language clusters used on Gab and the 4chan forum poll, which are referred to as galaxies. The results are equal parts fascinating and frightening. A comparison between poll and Gab highlighted that the top 10 words used to refer to Jews across both sites led to some very surprising results, including Ashkenazi, Sephard, Mizrahi, and Talmud. These are Hebrew terms referring to Jewish lineage. Ashkenazi refers to Eastern European Jews, Mizrahi to Iraqi and other Jews from the Middle East, and Sephardi to Spanish and Portuguese. Talmud refers to the Jewish Holy Scroll. The most popular term, Jew, appears in triple parentheses. This is known as an echo, and this is a signal which gestures to a specific language game in play. In these spaces, an obsession with Jewish history, Hebraic tribal lineage, and religious terms are used as weapons of anti-Semitism. These online fringe communities are using the language of the Jewish people against them. We may remember that one of Goyim TV's suggested searches was hoaxes, words, and false flags. In the history of anti-Semitism, the alleged secret weapon of Jewish control is language itself. Jews control minds because Jews control language. Contemporary anti-Semites address this in two ways, either through assigning new reference to recycled terms, or, like Wilhelm Marr, creating new words entirely. Anti-Semitism can infect even the most molecular level of language. So that's looking at the language of anti-Semitism, but what about the language we use about anti-Semitism? In Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag observes that nothing is more punitive than to give a disease a meaning, that meaning being invariably a moralistic one. Any important disease whose causality is murky and for which treatment is ineffectual tends to be awash in significance. First, the subjects of deepest dread, corruption, decay, pollution, anomie, weakness, are identified with the disease. Then, in the name of the disease, that is, using it as a metaphor, that horror is imposed on other things. The disease becomes adjectival. The metaphor of illness is so ubiquitous, so familiar, that its status as metaphor and as a linguistic construct is often obscured, and the lines between real sickness and metaphorical sickness can blur. This explains why ideas of the Jew as society's plague structure the history of anti-Semitism, but the inverse is also true. By understanding anti-Semitism itself as a metaphorical illness, a sickness spreading indiscriminately between victims, prone to violent outbreaks and symptoms that manifest outwardly, we ascribe meaning to the illogical, the unknowable, and the unsayable core of anti-Jewish prejudice, and how it proliferates across populations starts to make sense. Today, we have navigated the dual meanings of viral as infectious contagion and online circulation, how anti-Semitism relates to illness and the internet. And we should note that even the word meme, like the happy merchant, derives from a biological context, used to describe gene-like infectious units of culture that spread from person to person. Perhaps we should be skeptical. The metaphor of illness makes it organic, even natural perhaps, and takes away the agency of the infected. But it leaves us with a final question. Can we detect a hope of immunity or even a cure? A survey conducted by the Hungary-based Action and Protection League, presented at a conference in Paris by the European Jewish Association, revealed the scope of the spread of anti-Semitism. Of the 16,000 people interviewed in Austria, Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Poland, and the UK, 1/5 strongly agreed with the statement that a secret network of Jews influences global political and economic affairs. A similar number, approximately 1/5, also agreed with the statement that the Jews exploit Holocaust victimhood for their own needs. This is before coronavirus, from the 26th of February 2020. In the United States, an automated FBI Twitter account shared a link to a PDF of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on August 19th, 2020, with absolutely no context. On Wednesday, the 4th of November, Georgia Republican and open supporter of the far-right QAnon conspiracy theory, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was elected to Congress, and she's recently been in the news for claims regarding Jewish owned and operated lasers. QAnon claims that the world is run by secret cabal of Jewish Satan-worshipping cannibal pedophiles who traffic child sex slaves in secret networks of tunnels below Washington, D.C. In the United Kingdom, here are the results of the Oxford Coronavirus Explanations, Attitudes and Narrative Survey, or OCEANS, conducted by the University of Oxford and published on the 19th of May, 2020. Regarding the question, Jews have created the virus to collapse the economy for financial gain, 5.3% agreed a little, 6.8% agreed moderately, 4.6% agreed a lot, and 2.4% agreed completely. That's a total of 19%, just under 1 in 5 people, that endorsed to varying degrees the idea that coronavirus was manufactured by Jews as part of a conspiracy. And we've seen today how the line of transmission works, from classical tropes to published texts to online spaces and back into the real world. And the spread shows no sign of slowing down. To conclude, these online anti-Semitic coronavirus conspiracy theories are a complex mutation of classical anti-Semitic tropes. We may shudder and recoil at the more cartoonish manifestations of the Jewish conspiracy theory and the diseased Jewish body, but can we spot the subtler strains? The signs of anti-Semitism in the contemporary moment are everywhere. They are not just hanging over the Los Angeles freeway for one afternoon. It's up to us to read the symptoms. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
So, Chloe, thank you very much for an insightful analytical presentation, a very timely one and very important. Thanks for your insights and stellar work. So we have about 25 minutes for questions and conversation. So I'm going to start off with I guess a bit of a question and challenge. So I think your analysis of Christian forms of anti-Semitism and right-wing forms of anti-Semitism is excellent and important, unfortunately, even in 2021. And you demonstrate that clearly in your analysis and presentation. So the explosion of right-wing nationalist anti-Semitism in Europe, in the United States, around the world is very important. And I think given the times we live in with COVID, you illustrate the dangers. I would like to challenge you in the sense, like in our environment, in sort of liberal institutions of higher education, can you explore, you didn't really touch on the demonization of Jewish peoplehood in Israel that much. You focus more on racist anti-Semitism and perhaps Christian anti-Semitism. In this space that we're operating, like in liberal academic circles, where the demonization of Jewish peoplehood in Israel, I argue, and not everybody agrees, and you may not, that it's an acceptable form of discourse in academia, in the best universities in the world. So as Israel also becomes demonized in this moment of COVID and the COVID economy and globalization, how, from a scholarly perspective, how do you engage the demonization? I guess anti-Semitism is a layer. There's the religious, there's the racist, but there's also an attack on Israel and Jewish peoplehood. How do you explore this type of anti-Semitism in this time of a COVID economy? What are the challenges that you face and some of the ideas that you have on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. I would argue that similar processes of emptying words of meaning and substituting them with new reference is taking place in the circles that you outlined, in the sense of where perhaps the word Jew has meant different things at different points to do with the language of race, the language of religion, the language of negativity. We're seeing a similar thing happen with concepts such as Zionism and concepts such as Israel. And this is to do with the way that certain paradigms, particularly in certain academic contexts, certain types of theory, certain spaces, have constructed a paradigm whereby Israel and Zionism stand in for forms of alleged colonialism, racism, etc. And so it's actually a very similar linguistic process that's going on. I chose to focus on different words, but it's absolutely the same mechanics going on to do with taking a trope and emptying it of certain conditions to do with experience and filling it with ideas of negativity. And so that changes the coordinates of the conversation, but it's a similar process that's going on. And this has implications to do with ideas of, so I mentioned Jews as a religion, Jews as a race, Jews as a figure, and then we think about Jews as a people with national borders and having national interests. And there are various forms of anti-Semitism that can occur when we start to think about the Jews as a people. Double standards, delegitimization, demonization, and data, using fabricated data to support a point and circulating that online. So I don't necessarily see it as a challenge. I see it as perhaps an extension of particular processes that are taking place.
Okay, thank you. There's many questions and we have a bit of time. Amy Ellman has a very good question. If Amy can open her mic and camera, that would be great. And if not, I could read Amy's question.
Hi, Amy.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. In your discussion of the virus and the body, all of the memes were male until we got to pornography, right? And I was wondering if you could address to what extent this is gender specific, these memes before. Did you find anything prior that also caricatured women in similar ways, or is there something so male about anti-Semitism in terms of the mind of the anti-Semite?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because there is something implicitly gendered in the image of the Jew that we're seeing. And this is because certain elements of the anti-Semitism that I outlined are implicitly gendered, specifically to do with circumcision and castration as a feminizing activity, something which blurs the distinctions between fixed genders. I will refer to Sander L. Gilman's work on the gendered distinctions between representations of the male and female bodies. He has done some really great work on representations of Jewesses as inherently sexualized and connected to syphilis in a particularly interesting way. But I would also argue that the reason that we're seeing so many Jewish men in these spaces is because a lot of the iconography that is perceived as Jewish is to do with representations in the form of clothing and dress and hair that are traditionally male as well. So it would be difficult to represent an icon in the same way, but it absolutely is built on a distinctly gendered foundation. And it's important to note that. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. There's a question from Mohammed Ibrahim. Mohammed, if you'd like to ask the question, you're very welcome to. Mohammed, you're unmuted if you'd like to ask the question.
Hello.
No, I guess he's not here. So I'll read the question in the chat. Mohammed asked, "What do you think what are the reasons that most Arab world leaders relate their failures to Jews and to Israel? And is this feeding anti-Semitic issues or discourse in the Arab world?"
That's a great question. I will gracefully pass on any sort of detailed outline of the reasons why this may be, because I'm not a specialist in the Arab world. But I will just mention that a lot of really important work is being done at ISGAP on this question at the moment, including an ongoing seminar series. So stay tuned for more.
Okay, great answer, great answer. There's another question from Dorothy Van Heeswick. Dorothy, if you can unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask your question.
Thank you. Can you talk about the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a form of anti-Semitism itself? Also, the weaponization of anti-Semitism in order to curtail progressive movements, given the level of confusions you've outlined, that people are very vulnerable. Nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite, but they're very, Gentiles, I'm a Gentile, very vulnerable here.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just gonna write this down. So I'll address your first question and speak more to the weaponization of claims of anti-Semitism as a form of anti-Semitism. As I outlined, because the term itself has such a slippery history and can be used in so many different contexts and can be really deployed in so many different ways, this means that there really is a lot of difficulty with identifying what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And this means that while we have mechanisms such as the IHRA definition, in spaces where that definition isn't necessarily accepted, the charge of anti-Semitism contains a different type of weight and a different type of power. And so when we hear that claims of anti-Semitism are exaggerated or fabricated or blown out of proportion or are being hyped up by the media, we can find the roots of those claims in the very powerful classical anti-Semitic tropes, but they're just being used in the name of furthering progressive or otherwise forward-looking values. So it's just a question of locating the impulse towards thinking about what is it about the charge of anti-Semitism which makes it uniquely susceptible to being dismissed on certain grounds. And that is because of the history of the term. So that would be my answer to your first question. And it's actually connected to your second question, which is about the charge of anti-Semitism in particular spaces, and the difficulty of moving forward, particularly when having conversations, and what is the line between discourse and critique and delegitimization. And these are things that can really curtail productive conversation, because absolutely people are afraid to say the wrong thing. People don't want to cause offense. Often people don't know where to look for information as well. There are so many different sources. And I think that trying to undertake an education through identifying a number of sources across the spectrum of religious, political, academic, policy-driven institutions that are providing information about this issue, such as ISGAP, and being as informed as possible to then start the conversation is probably a good way forward. But absolutely, the charge of anti-Semitism is a powerful one, and its power changes in different contexts. And I think it's important, but as I said, when talking about the IHRA definition, ignorance can't be an excuse. And I think that taking that as the start for the conversation is always a good place to begin. So I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Chloe. Joel Glazer has a question. Joel, if you'd like to ask, you're welcome to. Joel, are you there? Maybe he's not.
Hi,
So,
Joel.
no, okay. So his question in the chat is, in your opinion, Chloe, which is more dangerous, right-wing anti-Semitism or left, and he put in quotations, intellectual anti-Semitism, I guess, as it relates to the COVID economy?
That is an interesting question. I would argue that both forms are dangerous in their own ways. Both forms are distinct in their own ways and yet operate according to similar processes, as I've outlined. And we shouldn't assume that the dangerous consequences of one mitigates the other. I think that in some ways there are many more forms of overlap. And I think that the conversations are more similar than we might anticipate. And I would also be hesitant in even the degree to which labeling far right and far left as such staunch binaries to do with this conversation is helpful, to the extent that it mitigates the fact that anti-Semitism is the point of collision between the two.
Thanks. So thank you, Chloe. There's a question from Alan Smasson. Would you like to ask your question?
It's Mason.
Mason.
Yeah, just like Mason with an S in front. I'm a journalist. I'm actually the president of the American Jewish Press Association. And this is not on your subject at large, specifically about the context you were talking about. But I've noticed with more and more frequency that the traditional form of depicting the concept of anti-Semitism, written anti-Semitism with a capital S as a hyphenated word, has always been utilized by members of the press, particularly in the Jewish world. I've noted, however, many organizations with much more emphasis, including ISGAP, and writing the term as anti-Semitism, all lowercase and no hyphen. First off, why the difference? And does the changing of the term Semitic to a lowercase form have important context for us as writers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As someone working with literature, working with literary theory, I think it is of the utmost importance that we make carefully informed decisions about the precise language that we're using. So I think it's really great to bring this up. If we take the term anti-Semitism, anti as one word, dash Semitism capitalized, what that does implicitly is it legitimizes the existence of Semitism as a distinct body of people with a history, with an identity, perhaps with a language, certainly with a name. What that presupposes then is that there is a fixed subject to be anti. that is part of the very careful language games of Wilhelm Marr, to suppose that the Semites are the enemy that we have to obliterate, and yet determining who or what is a Semite is so difficult, but we know that they exist and they hide, and it's up to us to determine them. This is part and parcel of the mechanics of how the anti-Semitism operates, by legitimizing this abstract concept by giving it a precise name. If we then turn to anti-Semitism as one word, not capitalized with Semitism, what that does instead is it legitimizes the form of prejudice, and it not the subject of that prejudice. Anti-Semitism becomes the topic, it becomes the content, it becomes the name for anti-Jewish hatred, which is what it is. So it shifts the focus from the subject to the content. And I think that that's why I mentioned during my talk that I would be using the term anti-Semitism for anti-Jewish prejudice, because we should call it what it is. And so by making that subtle distinction, we're really starting to unpick the complexities of how anti-Semitism operates and functions at the most local level of the linguistic term itself.
Thanks, Chloe. Well said. I've also written about it, and I think Emil Fackenheim plays an important role in this whole conversation of how we use the term. It's important. Thank you. Andrew Bay has a question, or Bay. You are welcome to ask your question if you'd like.
Yeah. How would you limit the spread of these radical ideologies? As a conservative, which I apologize for, I rarely use Gab or Parler, but I'm aware that some fringe right-wing groups do conflate like these very kooky conspiracy theories with, Jews painted in a very negative light. Should these platforms be completely censored?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because I approach it from, I'm not approaching this from the point of view of someone who works with the technology or works with the algorithms. So I can't speak to that side of it, but from the perspective of someone interested in the language and the discourse of anti-Semitism, what I will say is this requires a certain type of reading. It requires a reading between the lines. It requires a reading for codes, a reading for words which are slippery, which change, which are confusing, and which point to something that they don't necessarily mean. And that makes it very difficult to censor, because it needs to operate from an informed position of spotting what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And especially when we look online, as I said, we have these very cartoonish, exaggerated manifestations. But when we start to have the subtler strains, and going back to the earlier question about prohibiting conversation, what is the level at which conversation turns into critique? Is something that is very difficult to determine. I'm not sure what the answer is, but what I do know is engaging with the history of the specificity of anti-Semitism as a form of prejudice, and understanding that there is this very particular component to do with language, to do with the way that people talk about what is and isn't anti-Semitism and how that operates, takes us closer to the answer. But that's all I have at this moment on that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Eric Seidel, you have a question? You feel free to ask.
I do. Thank you, Dr. Small. Chloe, excellent presentation. In so many cultures and groups, leaders preach victimization, that your problems are due to somebody else. And as a result, there is an inferiority complex that is nurtured in that way. How much of that do you believe feeds into anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that the idea of the Jew as a victim and a perpetrator is very important. And it speaks to the complexities of the Jew as a figure, that somehow the Jew can be responsible for the suffering in the world, and yet they capitalize on the fact that they suffer the most. And by capitalize, of course, I mean in the monetary sense as well. So in terms of the role of the Jew in terms of processes of victimization, I think it's important for us to remember that it's a form of punching up and punching down at the same time. And the way that that operates in very complicated ways means that the Jew can profit from their own victimization, which undermines the status of the victim. So when I mentioned the survey which asked people their opinion on the question of whether Jews used the suffering they endured during the Holocaust for their own gain, would be part of that. And I think, yeah, cultures of scapegoating are very important, and the Jew as a figure has a very specific role in that history.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. So we have time for, I think, one more question. Max Story, would you like to ask your question? I think you have to.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, as anti-Semitism is such a massive sort of mythology, you might be able to term it, do you think that the use of so many different terms to define Jewish people in terms of anti-Semitism shows a lack of like a coherent ideology among anti-Semites?
Okay. I think that the idea of anti-Semitism as a mythology is very interesting. We can refer to the work of Adorno and Horkheimer on the connections between mythology, Enlightenment, dialectical thinking, and anti-Semitism, and how that plays out. So I think that's a really interesting idea. Do I think that the different terms used to refer to Jews speaks to a lack of a coherent ideology among anti-Semites? I think that would rely on a question of what we mean when we refer to ideology and what we mean when we refer to coherency, because as we know, there are very specific particularities about manifestations of anti-Semitism in all different ways. That doesn't mean that they are not aligned in some cases or feed off each other in other cases. Whether there's one coherent ideology, I think absolutely begs the question of what is ideology. What I will say is that certain tropes appear almost as canon for across the spectrum of anti-Semitism and manifestations of anti-Semitism. And those traits create a coherent image of the Jew, which is also completely incoherent, which is built on contradictions, which is built on slippages, which is built on negativity, which is built on abstraction. And there's something, yeah, coherently incoherent about that. But I would be cautious about ascribing any sort of idea of a coherent ideology to that. I would also, with regards to the different terms used, I will say that they speak to different parts of that coherently incoherent image, whether it be Jews as a race, where we have the Semitic, whether we have Jews as a people, whether we have Jews as an image. I think it speaks to those different elements and how that all feeds together, how they operate in tandem and against each other, and how it creates something which can encompass all these different manifestations at the same time.
Cool. That was a good answer, in my humble opinion. Heavy. So Chloe, so we're out of time. Chloe, really thanks for an amazing presentation, and also thank you for all the incredible work you're doing, trying to understand and combat anti-Semitism. You're a valued, I think, emerging leader in the field. So thank you for being with us. I'll just say very quickly on March the 2nd, we were talking about the internet and anti-Semitism. Our colleague, the next Fellows seminar series will take place on March the 2nd. And Rafi Cohn Almagor will be speaking. He's a professor at the University of Hull in the UK. And he'll be speaking on taking hate seriously, the scope and the challenge of hate speech on the internet. And he's doing very much cutting edge work on that. So that's March the 2nd. And if anybody's interested in our other seminars, we have more seminars frequently in Arabic with an interpreter in Spanish and in English. And if you go to our website, you'll see all of our programming. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and stay safe. And we'll see you in our next seminar. And Chloe, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.